Welcome readers, scholars, autodidacts, and curious people. Welcome to the Ultimate Book of Ruth. It still astonishes me when I hear American women talk about women's rights as though women have always been able to speak our minds, write what we think, and act independently. It shocks me when I encounter women who feel there should be more laws regulating what women can and cannot do. One of my cousin's daughters argued with me about women's organizations because she believed women were getting unearned privileges for having groups like women's architectural associations. I reminded her that women were not allowed to earn college educations in America until a few decades before the Civil War, and that women were not allowed to be professional architects until the early 20th century. She refused to believe. Does not, unfortunately, value a college education at all, believing conservative TV hosts who argue that paying for an education is not a worthwhile expense. She knows I have a college education, so I did wonder if she was just trying to make digs about my choice to go away from our family's small hometown in order to get a college degree. The conservative backlash against our public education systems in America has not only made expenses for attending college skyrocket in the last 30 years, so that very few people can actually afford a 4-year bachelor's degree anymore, but also completely discouraged many poorer Americans from improving their minds at all. After all, conservatives don't want well-educated Americans realizing how much these groups are harming our democracy. Democracy as a threat seems strange to most Americans. But when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her Vindications books, first the Vindication of the Rights of Men, and 2 years later the Vindication of the Rights of Women, the French Revolution was happening. And the British, having experienced one revolution that overthrew their monarchs in the previous century, were hemming and hawing about whether or not they, too, should once and for all throw over their monarchy in order to establish a democracy like America had done and France was doing. In the end, they compromised, shoring up some Republican aspects of local elections while still retaining their monarchs. It might be useful at this point in the video to provide distinctions between what a republic is and what a democracy is. A republic is built on elections, but the only people who can vote are those who own land. So in most historical cases of republics, such as ancient Greece and Rome, only men, especially wealthy men, were able to vote because only men could own land. America, in its earliest form, was indeed a republic. A democracy, on the other hand, is more egalitarian, because every adult, no matter whether they own land, what level of income they have, what religion they believe in, what color or gender they might be, can vote. So is more evenly controlled by the overall population of a country. America has long aspired to be a democracy, and has in fact fought wars to preserve democracy. A year after the French Revolution began, a revolution which was inspired by the American Revolution against the monarchy in Britain, a British man who had been a supporter of anti-monarchical ideas, Edmund Burke, wrote an anti-revolutionary treatise called Reflections on the Revolution in France. Mimicking his writing style, partly as parody, but mostly to make a point to counter Burke's claims and insinuations about democracy, Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Man to point out the major flaws in Burke's thinking. Reportedly, she felt very passionate about the topic, and her publisher supported her in her effort by immediately preparing to print the pages of her Vindication as soon as she wrote them. Halfway through, apparently, Wollstonecraft became concerned about what she was saying, so stopped writing. Supposedly her publisher, who was a personal friend, told her he understood, and that he would immediately stop plans for the publication of the book. Apparently, his understanding of her situation was all she really needed to finish writing the piece, which was published anonymously. Because it mimicked Burke's own style, most of the people who read it in the first month after its publication assumed a man had written it, even though the piece clearly advocated for women to be included in the political sphere. However, once the second printing was set, Wollstonecraft's name was added to the piece, and most of the critics who had supported the piece when they thought it was written by a man decided to take umbrage with it, since it was actually written by a woman, demonstrating that the men of Britain wanted democracy for men, but not for women too. Britain was, by that point in history, a monarchy with republican aspirations. Wollstonecraft already had a reputation for being an outspoken advocate for women, since she had written a shorter piece called Thoughts on the Education of Daughters 4 years prior. So some better read Brits were familiar with her point of view. However, the political commentator William Godwin, who would become Wollstonecraft's husband 5 years later, met her at a dinner party where the two reportedly got into a heated argument because of their differing views on politics. In the meantime, Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Women, one of the first open manifestos written by a woman that called for equality between women and men, in which she argues that individuals should be respected for their individual skills and knowledge, and that everyone should be given an education, and that the idea of everyone should always include women. Many scholars point out that Wollstonecraft's Rights of Women subtly reminds readers that women are human beings, thus should be afforded the same human rights men enjoy, such as individual autonomy to decide one's own fate, one's own career, one's own way of interacting with the world and with the rest of human society. This idea that all human beings are equally important was not only born out of the American ideal in our Declaration of Independence, but also carried forward by abolitionists who sought to end slavery of every kind. Women were at the forefront of both the growing feminist movement and of the abolitionist movement, both in Britain and in America. So here's a great spot to give Eileen Hunt Botting's basic definition of feminism, for those of you still struggling with the word. Botting reports that the term feminist was coined in France in 1870 and was immediately largely accepted to mean any argument or activism that worked against the patriarchy, or an arbitrary male privilege often given merely because the person has a penis, on behalf of the welfare of women as a group. For those of you who are Christians who struggle because some people of your faith firmly believe women and others who are not adherents of your religion are secondary creations, Botting reminds us that Wollstonecraft understood her critique of slavery as a logical application of the principles of Christianity. In particular, the idea that men and women were created as moral and rational equals in the image of God. Wollstonecraft adroitly demonstrates that, because of social pressures to keep women hidden in the home, women were not allowed to flourish in fields dominated by men, so that when men, like philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, argue that women do not belong in military camps because of their weaker nature, such men need to admit first that social programming is what makes women weak, not their biological nature. If the suppression of women continues, Wollstonecraft warns, women will be considered as only the wanton solace of men when they become so weak in mind and body that they cannot exert themselves. To demonstrate what wonders women can create, once freed from social bondage, Wollstonecraft goes on to list the many professional fields women could contribute to, from becoming physicians to being political philosophers like herself. Would men but generously snap our chains and be content with rational fellowship instead of a slavish obedience, they would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens. Way before it was fashionable to do such things, Wollstonecraft lived and traveled with an American named Gilbert Imlay, with whom she had a daughter. During this tumultuous relationship, Wollstonecraft continued to write and to publish while she traveled, eventually leaving Imlay after twice attempting suicide over the relationship. Later, she reconnected with William Godwin in London. A few months after they married, however, Wollstonecraft died from health complications from giving birth to Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who grew up to marry the bigamist poet Percy Shelley and to write her infamous novel Frankenstein about the potential horrors of science. Many would argue that Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley merely followed in her mother's footsteps, but more need to admit that they were both intelligent and passionate women who followed their paths rather than those laid out for them by the patriarchal societies in which they lived. Because her husband, Godwin, wrote Wollstonecraft's memoir revealing her unconventional lifestyle, her reputation as a political philosopher was ruined for a time, since women were not supposed to follow their desires like men did, until her writings were rediscovered by American feminists and abolitionists in the mid-1800s. When Wollstonecraft was 24, she moved in from financial necessity with her married sister Eliza to help her sister care for her newborn. Wollstonecraft was able to tell that her sister was unhappy in her marriage and encouraged her to leave her abusive husband. At the time, fathers were believed to own their wives and children, so the two sisters were forced to leave the baby behind as they fled. Possibly through the father's neglect, the baby died at less than a year old. Because of the scandalous act of leaving her abusive husband, Eliza was never able to marry again. But Wollstonecraft never stopped trying to rescue Eliza and other women. What she witnessed in her life led her to become one of the strongest, earliest advocates for women's rights in the Western world. Her Vindication books led to the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It's up to us to determine what kind of world we live in. So remember to act as though you are living in the kind of world where this claim is, indeed, a fact. In other words, elevate the value of women in your lives by learning to listen, to understand, and to appreciate what they bring to the table. Keep reading. Please like, subscribe, and share.